Welcome to the Balance and Brilliance podcast, a space where different perspectives and ideas converge to create powerful change. I'm your host, Terrence Hanna, serial entrepreneur and performance coach, and I'm joined by host Zoe McMahon, Fortune 100 executive and lifelong change maker. In this show, we share our complementary experiences and perspectives on topics that both propel and limit us all. We hope that by tuning in, you're able to launch yourself further with balance and brilliance. Like and subscribe to support the channel, and be sure to drop a comment below to lend your balance and brilliance to the world. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, welcome to Balance and Brilliance. Today we have a massive topic that we want to cover that literally affects every single living person on the earth, and that is navigating change. I have the wonderful Zoe McMahon with me here. How are you doing today, Zoe?
Oh, I'm great. And like you, I think this is one of my favorite topics for the reasons you said. I think it's massive and can't wait to get into it. Let's go.
Me too. Something I think is so important with change too is that in in it affecting every single person, the circumstances of change are always revolving. They're always moving. It's an infinite vector that we need to be just constantly used to. But how you manage that change almost universally can be very, very similar, uh, basically across the spectrum. What are your thoughts on that?
Wow, I don't know. I think there's so many different kinds of change that we're experiencing all the time. And I wanted to add to your point that it not only does it affect everybody, but it is the only constant, right? And there's a classic statement that change is the only constant, right? And everybody from Greek philosophers to Buddhist tradition, it's all around the fact that there is no escaping change at all. That is life. And so I find it super interesting that not only do we, is it like that constant and affecting everybody, but somehow we simultaneously want it but don't like it. It's this very strange paradox. And so, to your question about how we respond to it, I do think it's quite contextual, depending on the circumstances you're in and whether it might be something that you're in control of or whether you're it's happening to you or whether it's something you wanted or didn't want, right? So I think it really depends on the context, but for sure there is no escaping change at all.
Well, you said something there that really kind of I thought was interesting is change is the only constant. We all know that, but it's also something that all of us don't typically like. And it's funny that we live in this reality where we don't like something that's an absolute certainty. And I guess my comment around, if you maybe rephrasing it, the tool bag of dealing with change, I think a lot of the tools that we keep in that tool pouch can be used universally in different aspects of different types of change. Um, I know that you have a lot of experience in navigating change with groups and organizations, and I think me personally, just in my own life experience and business experience, have a lot of experience in navigating uh, or the challenges that are presented when change is happening. And I think today, just having this discussion of different types of change that we've been faced with, different types of change that will generally present itself in specific circumstances, and maybe us talking and sharing our expertise and our failures in dealing with these things can help some of our listeners here at Balance and Brilliance.
Yeah, and also I think to begin to accept the reality that everything is changing all the time. Some of our resistance to change is perhaps born from some comfort or attachment to the way things are. But simply even having the mindset that, wait, everything always changes is a relaxing mindset for me because it takes away some of the pressure. And so I hope people also find it beneficial to just kind of learn from us, but also just to learn that it's completely normal, right? It is what it is. So I find that peaceful.
You know, in I generally speaking, I think the vast majority of people are actually quite comfortable with the concept of change over a slow, sort of exposure to it. I think what the vast majority of people really struggle with is sudden change. When something happens that just changes the dynamic. I Examples off the top of my head is the death of a loved one. That's very, very difficult to
Mhm.
deal with that change in your life.
Sure.
Your favorite boss moves on to a different company, and now you have new unknowns coming in. And
Right.
it's it's the perceived threats to the stability. And I think it's that stability that many of us really crave, and that's why the change is
Mm.
threatening in the immediate short term.
I have a perfect example of this exact point that is from my own world. So if I might share it,
Please.
and it's such a stupid example, but when we were in COVID, I was attending a yoga studio fairly frequently, and I really enjoyed the teacher. And unfortunately, as many small businesses suffered through COVID, her business suffered as well, as you might imagine during the initial shutdown. And within about 6 weeks of COVID, she wasn't able to sustain the rents, and it was very quick. And she had to leave town and move to a different part of the country to be able to afford, I mean, her lifestyle, whatever. And I was absolutely devastated about this change in my life, that this yoga teacher that I had suddenly just disappeared from my life. And I can tell you, I sulked about it for about 2 years. Didn't go back to yoga for like 2 years after that because I was so hung up and attached to this teacher and the stability that you just described that it took me a long time to get over it. And that's a really, I look at that as a kind of really stupid thing of me, but it happened.
But I think that happens to all of us. And I mean, I think there's really you can go examples of that like across the spectrum of these types of changes. And I mean, there's I think again, it all comes, it not just the perceived threats to stability, but there's also a perception of the change as well. Is it a
Mhm.
positive change? Is it a negative change? You know,
Well, and how much control did I have over it as well?
absolutely. And not only that, realizing and understanding that even positive change brings challenges. So a really
Mhm.
amazing example of this is somebody who wins the lottery. If you win the lottery, our initial thought to that change is overwhelmingly positive. There can be some very significant drawbacks that come from that, right? So I think that accepting the fact that I think what's a good way of saying this? I think maybe minimizing expectations of change in either direction um, can be very positive in sort of like next steps moving forward in that. But I know we're in the midst of a three-part series on change here, and this is the very first uh, just dealing with the challenges of it. And I know we're going to get into more of that later. So
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a word you said, which was threat. And there's a model that I'm familiar with. I don't know if you know it. It's called SCARF. It's by a guy called David Rock, and it's a psychology, neuroscience model. And the theory of it is that the brain interpret certain things in a very in the same sort of way as being actually threatened, right? Like on the when we were chased by lions or whatever, there are certain things that trigger that same threat response in us. And on the corresponding side, the reward component of it. And there are five things in this scarf model. Um, they are status. So if your status is threatened in a context, your I forgot what the C one is now. Okay, autonomy, relatedness, fa fairness. So if your fairness is challenged, and then the certainty. That was that stability point as well, right? So security, certainty, sorry, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And if any of those things are threatened, say, for example, your boss changes or your job changes, and one of those things is affected, you're going to feel that like neurologically, like threat to your system, and it destabilizes you. And so when we are knowing that those things can happen, right, when you're talking to other people and change is happening to them, knowing that they're having like this neurological response, which is really feeling threatened. I think being aware of that is important, to know that of yourself and to know that of other people if you're trying to understand what they're going through as well.
Absolutely. I think um, you would say something that really stands out to me, and that I think is going to become, well, I know will be very prevalent in our following discussions on change, but is the autonomy. Um, Something that I think all of us crave on some level is autonomy in one area or another. Um, and when that autonomy is threatened, that's something that can really have very profound effects on us, as well as all of the other points of the SCARF acronym that you had just talked about. And something that I think is really important, that so much of this boils back down to, whether it's acknowledging the change, dealing with the change, everything is your self awareness, being aware that this change is happening, being aware that you're going to be uncomfortable and you're not going to like it. And something, as a coach, that I love tying all of this back to is the opportunities that creates. The greatest innovations, whether it's technological or personal, are born from necessity. And
Mhm.
I feel like, again, being self-aware that this change presents an opportunity is fantastic. Now, that's whether the change is positive or negative. And this goes, something that I absolutely love about coaching, and I when I was in school for it, I talked about this quite frequently, is it's sort of the culmination of every best line you've ever heard, and an explanation of where those lines kind of come from, right? So, the example in this case would be silver linings, right? You can always find a silver lining. But if you dig into that a little further, there's opportunities for growth, there's opportunities for success. And none of those would be present without change and without
Mhm.
that situational thing happening. So
Yeah,
yeah,
there's a lot in Buddhist teaching in particular about the concept that, a particular change, for example, is neither good or bad. It is simply happening.
yeah,
And now that's very hard when it comes to some tough life events, like you mentioned earlier, right? It's very difficult for someone who's just lost someone to objectively stand back and say, oh, I don't know, is that good or bad? That's not a question that's interesting to them in that moment. But at a very, very zoomed out level, um, all of these changes are inevitable in some sense,
mhm,
including losing people. And you don't know in that moment the next set of events that are going to come from that change in your life that could take you in a completely different path than you would have been, had that change not happened. And the idea that we could prevent those changes from happening is foolish anyway. So I think in those moments of loss, and I mean, loss is a topic we could talk about a whole episode on loss, but in those moments of loss, it is helpful to remember that, yeah, everything is changing all the time, and those feelings of negativity or sadness that we might have over something that changed that we didn't want it to change, accepting that again can bring that peace. But you said something as well that I thought was interesting about acknowledging change. And I this morning I was thinking about the difference between the word accepting and acknowledging. And I think typically accepting that change always happens sounds a little bit like, sitting back and accepting that stuff's just going to happen and it's kind of passive. Whereas I think the concept of acknowledging is has a little bit more agency to it, right? And it's like, yeah, I understand and I acknowledge that life is changing around me, but and I can now sort of use that fact to support me in my growth. I can use that to find these possibilities, as opposed to kind of being like reluctant and resigned to the fact that I can't change anything because everything's always changing around me anyway, and I have no control. So this notion of agency in changing yourself and trying to change your circumstances, I think, is really important, and is terminology of acknowledging change versus accepting it, I think, is an important one.
I think an example of the coping mechanism of that change and the acknowledgement of that, a really fantastic example that came to mind just now is going into ice cold water. So if you're standing on the edge of a pool of ice cold water and you can acknowledge that it's cold and that there's going to be your circumstances are going to change significantly when you get in that water, you're much more likely to get in that water willingly and actually have a positive takeaway from it, as opposed to
Mm.
somebody pushing you in that water. If somebody
Yeah,
pushes you in
I'm never gonna, I'm never going to be one of your ice bath people. I'm never going to get in that cold
Oh no,
water.
I am certainly not that ice bath person either, but I'm thinking back to a time when I was in Mexico and I jumped into this cold pool knowing it was going to be freezing. And let me tell you, I got out of the pool pretty quick, but I was able to get out of the pool and be like, oh, I feel good. I didn't like it, but
Mhm.
it was a good experience. As opposed to if someone pushed me in that pool, I would get out and probably have some very choice words for them. So
Yeah.
I think that the interpretation of the experience after it's been acknowledged is much more positive than going into it blind, if you will.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you something on that last point about the Mexico jumping in the ice. Do you think that that event was something you're proud of, like looking back?
No. And the reason that I say that is because I think it's an insignificant example. I think so here's a similar example of something that I am actually quite proud of, and that's skydiving. So
Okay.
replace the pool with the outside of a
Sure.
plane, and it all still applies, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
if someone pushed me out of a plane, I would probably not have as much fun as and the mental actually this is a phenomenal example. So when I went skydiving, the hardest part of skydiving was actually not skydiving. It was mentally preparing yourself to jump out of the plane. So I remember very vividly while we were flying up, I remember looking out the window of the plane and thinking to myself, holy, is this high? And very shortly after having that thought, I was like, we've got to be getting close. And I was trying to like hype myself up. And the pilot came on the radio and said, we just reached the halfway mark. And I was just like, had this like sinking feeling of like that. I thought that was going to be hard. And so overwhelmingly so, because I've only ever done it once, full disclosure, but overwhelmingly so, the hardest part was getting ready to do it. And
Right.
surprisingly, the easiest part was doing
Yeah. I,
it.
I I I can relate, and I've never done it, but the reason I ask about that is because I was thinking this morning about an example of when did I change? When did I do something that I would describe as a deliberate kind of I changed myself, or I did something that I thought it was created a change in me. And much smaller, much less significant example, but it was the time that I trained for a race, right? I hadn't been a runner up until a certain moment, and then I became a runner. that was capable of running this race. And I was thinking about that because that's always the example that I use for the things, one of the things that I'm most proud of. And so I thought that was a really interesting connection that it is when we make an effort to kind of change ourselves and we when we look back, it's like, oh yeah, I'm really proud of that. So it's almost like a big reward again for having achieved something in terms of change
Mhm.
that I think we remember looking back as a major accomplishment.
Okay, so I just want to touch back quickly on something that you said there about running the race and like comparing the significance of that change and that experience to someone else. Um, I think that later on in what you were talking about how you relate that to being, a major achievement for you. And I think that really highlighting the importance of those major achievements without comparing them to anybody else is critical to moving through that change. Because when you're in a circumstance of uncomfortable change, one of the most fundamental things that you have to lean on to get through that change is your inalienable strength and your successes and victories that you've had in the face of adversity. So I certainly think that making sure that we're always lifting up those achievements and that we're celebrating those achievements for the importance that they hold to us as a person, as opposed to, and I think we're all guilty of this. I do this too, but that was something that really stood out to me there. And seeing as we're on the topic of the challenges of change, and even though this is a very minor example of us having different thoughts on something, which I love, one of the biggest challenges of change, I think, when you're in a group setting, let's say you're work as a team at work or a family or something to that effect, is keeping a unified vision, making sure that all the parts of the car want to move in the same direction. Because I think that in the moment where all of those want to go in a different direction, that's kind of where the car explodes, right? Um,
Yeah, and
what are your
actually,
thoughts on
we're
that?
going to talk later about in another episode about this, but there's in the concept of change management, there's a famous analogy in a book called Switch that is called, it talks about change require thinking of change as a rider, an elephant, and a path. And the rider is the kind of rational mind. The elephant is the emotional mind and is hard to budge. And the path is the place to get you from where you are to the place of change, right? And Switch talks about, how you need to have in your mind all three of these aspects. The rider needs to be on board, the elephant needs to be on board, and the path needs to be clear.
Yep.
And what you just were describing when you've got like multiple riders, right? And multiple elephants, like how on earth can you corral like all of these individuals who are heavily weighed down by their emotional context and their history and the different ways things mean to them, grabbing that, um, getting all of that emotional baggage to change at the same time. The big key to driving change in these group settings is to make the path clear and simple for people. And I think having that vision is part of making that path clear and simple because now we've got line of sight, right? So I fully agree with
Absolutely.
what you said.
Well, and I think it, from a in moments of change, there's a lot more conflict that can arise within, individual stakeholders in any group because, and obviously this unified vision is quite important. But something else too that can happen with that is if people have obviously everyone's going to have different perspectives, but if they're moving in different directions, that will naturally lead to gaps in trust. That's naturally going to lead to gaps in communication. That's going to lead to, and all of these lead to, failure of the organizational structure. So I think that having these like clear, defined rules, or rules is a bad word, but the guidelines, the path, if you will, and then people having the autonomy to experience it as they're experiencing it, but knowing that that's okay, and we're working together.
Hmm. And as I think this autonomy thing is interesting. We don't always have it, right? And as we talked about earlier, in changes that are sort of forced on us. And so, bringing all this together a little bit, I feel like sort of where we've been here is that, change is really constant with us, yet we all resist it at some level. And that's for reasons of threats to our sense of self, our identity, our security that are fundamental to human needs, right? That we need that sense of stability. And so I think, and now, yeah, as we start to talk a little bit later about embracing change and managing change, some of the tools that you've mentioned, like around having that simple vision and having your skills on your side and stuff like that, are all things that are going to help us navigate this really complicated, like, dynamic that we're all dealing with every day, in this reality where there is no choice. There is change, like, constantly. So, embrace it or don't, but it's happening. So I feel
Yeah.
like we've set up like some awesome avenues for us to go deeper into. What do you think?
I really think so. And on the concept of like the challenges of change, something that I'll end with on this one that I think is, I when I was sort of collecting my thoughts for this, I thought a really amazing way, to showcase that it's everybody that deals with this would be sort of contrasting opinions from different places, but that kind of say the same thing. So what I came up with is the US Marine Corps: improvise, adapt, and overcome. And then we have the legendary James Dean: I can't change the direction of the wind, but I can change the direction of my sail to get to my destination. And the thing that I love about both of those comments, which are universally applicable, is that in a moment of change, the thing that needs to change to overcome it is you. And the only person who can adapt, the only person who can change the sail is you. And
Mm, I love that. And I'm going to throw one more quote at you from
please,
a book
yeah,
that I read recently. And it goes back to what I said at the beginning about peace. So I'll throw this reminder in for our listeners. The only way to find solid ground is to make peace with the truth of impermanence.
say that for
So
me one more time.
the,
I loved it. I want to hear it again.
yeah, the only way to find solid ground is to make peace with the truth of impermanence.
I very much dig it.
Yeah. But I think you're right. Once you've made peace with that, it's in your court. You've got the ball. I love what you said there.
Well, I can't take credit for it. That was the US Marine Corps.
Well, I can't take credit for that one
I'm
either.
happy to parrot it back to you and our listeners and provide some original thoughts for this show. And I really thank you for bringing your perspective. Something that I love about this is, you and I are very different people. We come from different places, and we can always come together and we can share these thoughts and experiences. And every time that we do, I think we learn from each other. And something I'm extremely excited about with this show is to not only have the opportunity to share that balance and brilliance with the world, but to glean it from everyone else who comes across this channel. So for anyone listening right now, if you have something to add to this, we encourage you to participate and lend that balance and brilliance to the world. Leave us a comment, a like, subscribe. It all helps the channel, and it all helps share it all with the world. And I'll pass it over to you, Zoe, for anything else you have.
I think we're good, but go change. You know, it's a reality, and we can let it make us sad, or we can let it make us glad and move forward. And I think, I'm all about the latter, and hope our listeners find something that they can take from this and drive change in their own life. And I look forward to going a bit deeper into some more tips in our next episodes on change.
Sounds great. Well, I can't wait to get into leading and driving change. So that's going to be our next segment in the change series. Thank you again for everybody tuning in, and we will catch you in the next one.
In this first episode of a Balance and Brilliance series on change, we talked about the realities of change and its impact on us both psychologically and practically. We kicked off with the universal truth that change is constant, yet it's something we often resist. As Terry put it, we seem to live in a reality where we don't like something that is an absolute certainty. The rate of change, our control over it, and whether we perceive it as good or bad all seem to influence whether change throws us off balance. I shared my own rather silly struggle with change when I lost access to my yoga teacher during the pandemic. Not my most enlightened moment. We explored how this sense of destabilization often stems from feeling threatened. I brought up David Rock's SCARF model, which outlines the factors that can make us feel psychologically threatened when they take a turn for the worse. Major life events like job loss or the death of a loved one are obvious triggers. These threats are constantly present as our environment shifts. Terry pointed out that maintaining a sense of autonomy amidst change can come from acknowledging that change is inevitable, and it will make us uncomfortable for a while, but knowing that is important. But he also emphasized his usual opportunity mindset, and with every change, there is a chance for growth and success. His skydiving adventure served as a perfect example. The hardest part wasn't the jump itself, but gearing up for it. And when we put in the effort to change, we can look back and feel proud of ourselves. As we wrapped up this chat, we shared some wisdom from some pretty diverse sources. Terry drew his from the US Marine Corps, whose slogan is to improvise, adapt, and overcome. As well as the one and only Jimmy Dean, who said, "I can't change the direction of the wind, but I can adjust my sails to always reach my destination." I summed up my own thoughts with the profound truth I recently came across. The only way to find solid ground is to make peace with the truth of impermanence. So it seems from all of that acknowledging and adapting to change is in our hands, no matter how you slice it. Well, we hope you'll join us for another episode in our Change series. And of course, if there's a topic you'd like us to discuss, do drop us a comment. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.